that. Okay, so we got through the syllabus and the examples actually a little bit faster than I did on Monday. So the second portion that I need to do for you, I don't think it's going to take the whole period, but I do want us to go over some important vocabulary terms and concepts so that we can kind of spend the weekend thinking about what you want to do design-wise. So I just want to walk you through some of the important vocab terms. The probably easiest way to do that is with some visuals. I'm going to actually pull this from a presentation that I used for my Art of Preach class. So that gives us a lot of the same vocab information that is right here. This is the notes handout that's in that notes folder, and you can use this as prep for the exam. If you lose this one, don't panic. I'll print it again. You already have that one twice, Kim, but there you go. I'm not going to go over every single page of this. I think it's more effective if we go back to it as we introduce each new thing, so don't get overwhelmed. Basically, each page of the handout is about a different print technique. So it is in the default order that I usually teach. It goes through woodcut and linocut first, so you'll have to flip a couple pages to get to try point. But most of what's on there that's really relevant to us is also here on the screen, so don't panic about what's on the page. The first couple terms that are really important for us include the term matrix. And the matrix, for our purposes, is the master image. It's the thing that you either carve or scratch or chemically etch in the case of the etching project. It's the thing that you make on the printing plate that holds the ink. So the matrix is what you're creating. You could almost think of that as like the master copy. In a way, it almost is the art itself. The matrix is what creates the printability of it, right? So the matrix is like creating the image on the printing surface. We usually refer to the surface we're working on when we're doing dry point, engraving, etching. We're going to call it the plate, largely because it's very thin, right? A piece of plexiglass or copper is relatively thin. When we switch over to do things like woodcut, we're going to suddenly have fairly thick blocks. So you'll hear the term plate or block basically means the same thing. It's the surface you're working on. But in either case, whichever material you're using, whatever technique you're doing, you are creating the matrix. So the next big term there is addition. And this is what I was referring to at the beginning of the period, that the addition is a term that we use sometimes for collector's items. I'm sure you've heard the phrase limited edition blank, right? Like with collector's plates or even cars, right? Limited edition. The idea means that it is every single thing that is in the edition is identical to everyone else, but there's only so many of them available, right? If you go to a big chain store like Walmart, there's going to be bajillion of the same exact kind of cup, right, in the coffee cup aisle. We're making something where there's going to be a limited number of them. So the addition is the term that we use for the number of actual impressions or the actual number of prints that you have that you've created from your matrix. So most of the time, you will decide ahead of time how many there's going to be. Are you going to make 10, 25, 200, whatever the number is going to be? You decide it usually ahead of time. I know some printmakers who do it the other way. They print until they're exhausted. Then they go through and pick out the ones that aren't good and throw them away, and then they number the edition to whatever random number they have left. But most of us decide ahead of time. I'm shooting for 50, right? So I will probably, if I'm making an edition of 50, I will print more than that. Because inevitably, you're going to have one that comes up light, or that you tear the paper, or it's slightly crooked, or you'll make mistakes along the way. So what we do with any of the ones that don't come up to scratch, that aren't good, those just get torn up, thrown away. So once you've decided that you're going to set a particular number, you print, double check until you have exactly that amount. Then you can go in and do the numbering. So you don't have to panic about numbering them as you go. It's not like you print it and then immediately write down 1, print it again and write down 2. But keep in mind what you're shooting for. If you're shooting for an addition of 5, you're going to probably print 10 just to be safe. Get rid of the bad ones. When we do the addition numbering, it's going to look like a fraction. And if you've ever worked in shipping or receiving in any capacity, you know how those number systems work. 1/5 means the first one out of 5 altogether, right? So the lower number, the denominator, is your total number of impressions or total number of prints in the addition. And the top number, the numerator, is what of the numbering that you're looking at. Are you looking at the first, second, third out of however many? We have one kind of print that is not included in that numbering system, and that's our artist's proof, the AP. The artist's proof is arguably identical to all the rest of the ones in the edition, but it's the one that you pull at the beginning on good paper, the right color ink, everything is the same, but it's the first one that looks exactly how you want it to go. That one we put over to the side, and it becomes kind of like our benchmark or guide. We want all of them to look as good as that one. So we mark that one especially, either with just the initials AP. Some people write it out, artist proof. Usually you keep that one. If you're going to sell all of them, that would be the one you would hold on to for yourself, right? It is the only one that you could argue is of slightly higher value. Most of the editions, every single print would be of equal value. If I had a print run of 50 in my edition, and you had 1 of 50, and I had 50 of 50, they should still be considered the same monetary value. But if Kim had AP from that edition, hers might be considered more expensive, right? Worth more. So that's all relative to the size of the edition, the size of the print, the fame of the artists themselves, right? So within reason, right? The other term up there, just regular proof, is a print that you pull to check your progress, just to see how it's going. Sometimes you'll have done a really intricate thing and you want to see how it's looking, and the only way to know that is to put ink on the plate and print it. But that doesn't mean the print is finished, right? That's just something that you're doing for your own processing. Those kind of proofs we don't label especially, and most of those just get thrown away. So a regular proof is sometimes even just done on crappy paper. We might pull them on newsprint just to not waste expensive paper. Test it out, see what it's doing, throw it away. So the artist proof is special. Registration will be important when we start doing things with more than one plate or more than one color, but it's the idea of lining things up so that all of the elements print in the correct place. The terms you definitely need, though, are the different categories. We're going to work with the major print categories of intaglio first, and then silkscreen or stencil, and then relief. So the intaglio comes to us from the Italian word meaning to incise or inscribe or to scratch. In all the intaglio techniques, the first ones we're doing, dry point and etching, when we scratch or etch into the surface, it's that scratched in or etched area that the ink is going to stick to. So literally the ink is going in the groove that you made. With relief printing, like woodcut or lino, it is the total opposite. If you're printing black ink on white paper, where you cut a woodcut block is where it's going to be white. The uncut part, the raised up part, is what's going to carry the ink. So intaglio and relief are total opposites. We'll do dry point and engraving in the intaglio technique. We'll go on to the stencil technique of screen printing, silk screen. We are going to use photo emulsion for our silk screens, which is super fun. For your silk screen, you're going to coat your silk screen with a chemical that is sensitive to light. It will harden, but not completely dry. If we keep it in the dark, it'll be fine. Let it dry overnight. We'll develop our artwork probably in a digital way, but it needs to be solid black, white. We'll print it, even if the image is going to be a different color. The design comes out totally black and white. We're going to print it onto transparency plastic. So you'll have a clean plastic sheet with just the shapes or letters, whatever your design is, in jet black. We'll put that positive, we call it, against the photo emulsion and put it in our exposure unit and expose it to UV light. And it does this amazing thing. Wherever the light hits the emulsion, it makes the emulsion turn solid. Where it's blocked by the design, the emulsion stays soft. So once the exposure is done, we'll take a hose and spray out the soft emulsion that was blocked by your design, and you suddenly have a stencil permanently burned onto this screen. So you can use that to print on t-shirts or onto fabric or onto other things. So y'all are going to do single color. Kim is going to boss up and do 2 colors. She looks terrified. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be so awesome.
I was just thinking to myself, oh, can I work with them?
Oh, yeah.
Because we didn't.
Because you had to do yours. You had to do yours an old school way.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're definitely going to have a big learning curve on that one, but you're going to love it. The thing about silkscreen is that if you do it right, it is relatively fast to get to a result. The downside is there are lots of little things you can screw up. Like you can accidentally forget to put the screen in the dark. And then of course the whole thing turns solid and right. So there are a handful of ways that you can mess it up, but we'll work through those together. Essentially it works as a stencil. And traditionally the Chinese invented it, and they did this incredible thing. They would cut their stencils out of paper. And I'm sure at some point you guys have seen like a spray paint stencil for doing numbers or letters. Like if you think of the letter O, in order to make a stencil that works like that, you'd have to have a little bridge to hold that center part of the O to block it so that it would not just come out as a solid circle. So the Chinese invented this technique of cutting all these intricate stencils, and then instead of a paper bridge, they would glue hair, horsehair, so that it would all stay in the right place, but because the hair was so thin, it would allow the ink to come through, so you wouldn't see the bridges. So eventually, once the silk development happened, they were like, aha, we can attach the stencil to the silk, and it'll allow the ink to go through that way. Then as we go forward, we start being able to do those stencils with different chemical alternatives. So a cheap way of doing it, you guys know that shelf liner paper that you can get, like you move in a new apartment and you want to line the cabinets, that stuff will stick, not permanently, but stick well to a silkscreen screen. So you could cut your stencil with an X-Acto knife out of this shelf liner paper, stick it to your screen, boom, boom, make an image. Peel it off, make a new one. So it really is a pretty versatile thing. The photo emulsion, though, can be removed, but it has to be removed chemically. The advantage of it is that it does allow you to do some things a little bit differently. You don't have to cut the stencil by hand. You can rely on something printed or drawn or even photographed. So we have lots of options when it comes to silkscreen. So we'll do the intaglio category, then the stencil category, and then we'll go back to relief, which again, where you cut it is where it stays white. What else do I want to say there? You guys in level 1 will be doing the last category on their monotype. Mono, of course, means one. This is the only technique where you won't make a matrix. You're going to freehand manipulate the ink and print it to paper. It's almost like making a painting in ink that you then preserve onto a piece of paper. Kim, for your mono project, you're going to do mono prints, which means you'll take a pre-existing matrix and hand color it so each time you print it, it comes out a different way. The simplest way to think of it is to take a lino cut, print one in red ink, one in blue, one in green. It can be much more complicated than that, but the idea is you'll have the same exact image, but each one will be a unique color variation. For these guys, the monotypes will be both a different image, different color completely. Right? No two will be alike. So that's our monotype versus monoprint. I want to show you this cool animation from the Museum of Modern Art, and I don't know why this link doesn't want to behave itself unless I do it this really janky old school way. Bless you. Same thing, but it doesn't want to let me in. There we go. This was developed by the Museum of Modern Art in connection with printmaking exhibitions, and it's a really quick and easy way of understanding what we're doing. So the first things that we're doing are going to be in the intaglio category, and Kim, this is literally what you're doing in level 2. So etching, or in our case dry point and engraving, will allow you to create linear images like this one by Picasso. The way that the etching works is pretty cool. You're going to take your copper plate and we're going to coat it with an acid resist. We're going to use paste wax, furniture polish, which has a little bit of a smell to it, frankly, but it's not horrible. It'll go on kind of soft and we'll let it dry. It'll harden overnight. Once it's hardened, you're going to go in with your etching needle and you're going to scratch through the wax to show the lines that you want to make. For those of us doing dry point, you'll take your plexi, take the dry point needle, and scratch the lines that you want. For Kim's process, you're going to put that plate into what we call the acid bath. You're going to use ferric chloride, which is a salt solution. It's not an acid. It does not release toxic gas. It looks the color of sweet tea. It gets darker as it eats away at the copper. If you spilled it on yourself, it wouldn't even really hurt you, but it would turn your skin Oompa Loompa orange. Temporarily. So I always suggest wearing goggles and safety gear, but it's not as dangerous as the traditional acids we used to use. Quite frankly, the acids that were used traditionally literally released gases that could kill you. And the way that artists worked on this process was just like you see on the animation. The plate would go in this liquid that was an acid, and as the acid ate away at the plate, it would release little bubbles of gas, which if you didn't brush them away, those bubbles would actually contain a little bit of metal. They were heavy. They would just rest there on the plate, which would prevent the acid from doing its thing. So you had to take a feather, literally like an eagle feather, and rub it back and forth. You had to stand over this plate, rubbing, breathing in all this. It was not healthy. We developed workarounds like extraction hoods that would pull the gas out of the room, but thankfully we now have ferric chloride, which again will turn you into Oompa Loompa if you use it wrong, but at least it won't kill you. Once the etch has happened, we would clean it all off, take off all of the wax, and then it's going to be exactly the same for you guys for dry point as it is for etching. We're going to now apply the ink. And you can do that in a couple ways. Some people will apply with a brayer roller. I like to use a little piece of cardboard, or mat board rather, as a squeegee and kind of scrape the ink across. This is a more traditional way of doing it using a dauber, but essentially you're putting ink over the whole surface. And when I first did this as a student, I thought this was crazy because my professor said, okay, put ink on it, now wipe the ink off. And I was like, dude, why did I put it on? Like, it didn't click for me, right? But when you start wiping it, it does this incredible thing. You see it's going in little circles. It takes the ink rather, off of the surface that's supposed to be white, but it kind of grinds it down into your grooves. So this is where you can control how much you take off and how much you leave on of that plate tone. But so you guys will do this for dry point. Kim will go through the etching process, but once you've got your plate inked like this, it's essentially the same thing. You have a plate with scratched or incised lines with ink in them. How the heck do you get the ink off of there onto the paper? That's where the press comes in. So the first thing we'll do is soak our paper in water. And this is really important to do because the paper has to be flexible. We're going to use a pretty thick paper, not as heavy as watercolor paper, but way heavier than what you use for drawing. That paper, if you use it dry, is going to be so stiff it won't go down in the grooves. So we'll soak it for about 10 minutes. We'll take it out of the water, get the excess water off of it. We usually blot it in between dry sheets with some weight on top, and that'll take the excess moisture out. Once we've inked and we're ready to go, we'll take the plate over to the press, we'll put it ink side up, we'll put the damp but not soaking wet paper on top, then the press blankets, then we'll lower the pressure and we'll run through the press. Now that press that we'll start with, the one by the classroom door, the whole mechanism is set up so that the roller itself is what moves. The press bed stays stationary, but the roller goes across. With this press, the Star Wheel press, this is a more traditional one, the roller housing stays in the middle and the table is what moves, the press bed moves in and out. But either way, you're applying with a roller really, really intense pressure, more than you could do by hand. The idea is that it'll force the flexible paper down into the grooves. The animation happens really fast. But I want you to just pay attention to the fact that it's only going under the roller once, then they raise the roller up and bring the plate back. You're not going back and forth. I made that mistake too. When I first was printing, I was like, well, if I go 2 or 3 times, it'll make it darker. Well, what it does is it slightly moves the plate and you suddenly get 2 or 3 prints on the same piece of paper. It just doesn't work properly. Another mistake that I made that was very silly in retrospect, but I couldn't figure out what was going wrong. I soaked all my paper, then I took it out and I left it on the table to the air. So I printed the first one, it was okay. When I printed the second one, it came up light. So I added more ink and more pressure and printed the third time and it was still light. And I added more ink and more pressure and they kept coming up lighter and lighter because the paper was exposed to the air and it was drying out. And I just didn't connect it. So the paper does have to be damp, not soaking wet, but damp. So here we go. Here's how the printing will look. We're on the press, ink side up, paper on top, blanket on top. We've lowered the pressure, run it through once, release the pressure, bring it back, take the blanket off, boom. So once you've got it making the image the way you want, the printing actually can go pretty quickly. Yes, you have to apply ink each time. There won't be enough ink on there to pull twice. So you'll have to take it off, ink it, wipe it, and go again. So we'll get into kind of a workflow. If you guys are both printing on the same day, probably what will happen is as soon as one plate comes off, the next plate can go on. And we'll just kind of keep it going in a circle. The other advantage of a smaller group, though, is that we can have both presses going at once. So we really could have 2 people printing simultaneously. And if we got in a real crunch, because the plates are small, we can do 2 plates at a time. You just roll across one, then roll across the other, and then lift up. So that's our etching process. We'll then go on to screen printing. This is sort of the more traditional way of doing it, cutting a stencil by hand, adhering the stencil, putting ink on the inside there, grabbing a squeegee, forcing the ink through, ta-da. So it really is kind of basic in the idea, but very diverse in what you can pull off with it. The woodcut and lino cut are very near and dear to my heart. It's my favorite of the techniques personally. It will not allow for quite as much detail as you can get in your dry point or your etching. It relies very heavily on strong contrast. Think what would look good as like a graffiti spray paint stencil, right? Very high contrast. The idea is you've got your design on there, you're going to take your gouge tool, which the tip of the tool will be shaped either like a letter U or like a letter V. The V's make thin lines, of course the U's make big, wider lines. We're going to cut away all the white space. And the only stuff that's still raised up is the image. We're then going to roll ink across it with our brayer. The ink is going to stick to the raised up part. paper on top. We'll burnish the back. You can do it old school with a wooden spoon. Don't use metal because, and I've done this, the friction from rubbing it really fast will heat it up, and you can actually burn yourself if you get the spoon too hot. And I did that the very first time. I thought, well, I'll just use a metal spoon, ha ha ha, and I regretted it immediately. Wooden spoon. Or we have some other tools that you can use called barons that allow you to hold kind of a handle, but they still allow you to put pressure down. But essentially, working from the middle usually out to the edges in a circular path, you are making pressure on the back there that transfers ink to the paper. So that's the basic gist of what you're doing. Obviously, your designs will be more complex, but this is really what you're about to endeavor to do, is to make art with these various techniques. So let's go back here and advance it to the dry point section. Go. So our intaglio, again, for incise or scribe or engrave, intaglio is about scratching into the surface. So there's a variety of techniques. You guys are going to do dry point and engraving, and these are considered the dry intaglio techniques, no acid involved. Kim, you're going to do etching, which obviously involves acid. You'll also do aquatint, which involves acid, and you'll do a mezzotint, which does not involve acid. Engraving, the lines are incised using a tool called the burin, and that tool you push away from yourself, and it makes a very even line, completely below the surface of the plate, nothing sticking up above the plate, so your lines will look very much like what a pen does on very smooth paper. With the dry point, you're using a tool called the dry point needle, and instead of pushing it away from you, you can pull it towards yourself the way you do a pencil or a pen. And that tool is designed not only to scratch a line in the surface, but it also kicks up a little of the plastic or the metal to the side of the cut, and it sticks upright. We call that the burr. And the burr and the line both hold the ink. So when we print a dry point, the line is going to be a little fuzzy. To me, it looks more like what a soft pencil does on rough paper compared to an engraving. So a lot of times people will not be able to tell the difference between them. At a distance, they just look like hatching and cross-hatching. But if you look really closely at the line quality, your dry point, the one you're going to do first, looks more like a soft pencil on a rougher paper. Your engraving is going to look more like a thin pen line on smooth paper. Does that make sense? A little bit different in the quality of line. Mezzotint, Kim, is the one you're going to hate in a way because there's a lot of prep. You're going to rough up the whole surface with a tool called the rocker. It's going to put burrs everywhere. So if you put ink on it and printed it, you would have a solid jet black rectangle. To create the image, you're going to lower some of the burrs by smoothing them out with a tool called the burnisher. It's very much like making a drawing with charcoal where you make the whole paper dark and erase out the highlights. It's a beautiful technique, but it does take physical effort. The etching is your fast one. You're going to prepare your plate, clean it, make sure there's no scratches on it, get it all nice and ready to go. You'll cut it with wax, scratch your design through, expose it to the ferric chloride, clean the wax off, put the ink on, and it'll be just like a dry point. The aquatint involves acid in multiple steps. It's my personal favorite of the acid techniques. You will create your design, you'll block out the areas you want to keep completely white, and then you'll put a light coating of spray paint, little dots, all over the whole plate. The reason the dots are there is so that there's a little bit of resistance to the acid, so it doesn't etch the whole thing to a flat level. You're going to have little pits. It will then be up to you to expose it more than one time in short etches to the acid. So everything that isn't covered by the wax will etch to be a light gray. You'll clean it off, cover more areas that you want to keep light gray, and expose it again. And then that will make everything that's exposed twice darker. And you just keep doing that. Cover, expose, cover, expose, cover, expose. So you'll be able to get a range of value. You'll still probably want to go in and put engraving lines or dry point lines to like kind of clean it up, but it's going to give you a range of values, which will look a little more like a painting. So what do those look like? Well, with all of these techniques, we're going to apply ink to the surface and then wipe it so the ink goes into our grooves and then prints to the paper. We looked at the press, but this is a basic press where you can see the roller stays in the middle and the press bed is what moves. Here's the way that we'll apply the ink for our dry point and engraving. We're literally scraping it across with rectangles or squares of mat board. We'll then wipe it with our tarlatan or cheesecloth. And again, that's going to take the ink off the raised area and grind it down into the scratches. And now it's ready to go. You'll go ink side up, damp paper on top, pull the press blankets down, roll across, and you'll print. So with engraving, you can get massive detail, lots of very thin, specific, clean lines, as in this piece by Dürer. The tool is called a burin, and you're going to push it away from yourself. It incises into the plate to create thin lines. When I first saw these, I thought they were broken because they do have a bend to them. That's so that you can get it really close to being parallel to the surface, but still have the end that you push, the handle, pointing upward so that you can get your palm around it. And you can see that in this shot. He's got the tip of it almost completely parallel to the surface, but he's pushing with the heel of his palm. So these are engravings by Cape Fear students. I really like these because it makes use of very straight lines to make the illusion of contours on the face. So you can do curves or straights, but you can see the lines are real clean, right? They look very orderly, very much like what a pen does. Isn't that awesome? Now, when you get close to it, this is a master engraver. This is Martin Schongauer from German Renaissance. When we pull in close, look at how even those lines are and how many there are. It's just it's amazing to me that people are able to get this kind of detail. The dry point, this is a piece by Picasso. Doesn't it look a little more like a pencil sketch? The lines are kind of wavery a little bit. So remember, your dry point's going to look a little more sketch-like, your engraving a little more pen and ink line drawing. The image that you see on the corner, bottom right, is a cross-section of your plate with the burr sticking up. So one of the key things to remember is that you won't be able to make like 100 of your dry points because the pressure of the roller is going to smash the burr down eventually. So somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen is acceptable. We're only going to do short editions. Ours is only going to be an edition of 5 with an AP, so 6 prints. It'll hold up to that for sure. The dry point needle is not the most sophisticated tool. It could be almost any of them. All of these are different styles of dry point needle that I've purchased for the classroom over the last 15 years. It could be something even more basic than that. If you have an old ice pick, you can sharpen it to a real sharp point. That would work. My dad made a beautiful dry point self-portrait with a roofing nail. He just sharpened it to a really sharp point and drew with it, and it worked perfectly. So really, it's not a fancy thing. It's a piece of cylindrical, hard metal that's sharpened to a point. That's your tool. The ones that I have the most of in class are this style, though. They almost look like pens. They're really easy to use. Oh, you just use one end and then turn it around. It's not meant to be used for both ends at once. The idea with that one is that, like, if one end starts to go dull, before you have to sharpen it, you can just flip it around and keep working. But that's why it's got 2. So there's, I think I showed you this one earlier. That's the plexiglass plate on the right and the print on the left. The print is on the right. But you can really see when you get up close to it, this is a student piece based on a photograph. You really can see that the dry point line feels a little more like a pencil on slightly rougher paper. It kind of wavers in and out. The thin and thickness changes a little bit. These are beautiful dry points. So the mezzotint, Kim, just so that you have an idea there, is going to allow you to make something that looks like a charcoal drawing. You will rough up the whole surface, and that's going to take at least 8 passes of this tool called the rocker. It's going to put burrs all over the whole thing. And there you see I'm rocking back and forth and working the tool away from myself, from my body away. Rock, 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 rock. I'm then going to use the burnisher and the scraper to soften some of the burrs, scrape some of them away, and it will allow you to create something that has a huge range of value from dark to light. These are all student mezzotints. The one at the top, the butterfly, is a really simple one, but so effective. It won a prize a couple years back in the end of the year student show. Very simple kind of idea, but beautifully executed. These are the master mezzotints. Carol Wax literally wrote the book on mezzotint. There is literally a book called Mezzotint by Carol Wax. She's a genius, but that's how she achieves these looks. And some of those are big. Some of her plates are in excess of 2 feet. Etching, your first one, is going to have a combination of feeling a little bit like a dry point and a little bit like an engraving. This is a self-portrait by my grandfather, actually. So that's, yeah, he was probably early 30s, 31, somewhere around there. So the old school way of doing it, if you've ever been behind one of those machines that's laying asphalt on a new road and you know that horrible smell, that's what we used to use. The tar-like part of asphalt is called asphaltum. It's what's the horrible smell when they're laying a new road. You can see it to harden. You'll have your master design on a piece of tracing paper so that you can lay it down, make a mark so you know exactly where you want to scratch. Once you have scratched through, and this is not the best design, but you can really see what the ferric chloride does. Here's the design, free-handed from a photograph. He then places it inside the acid bath, and you can see that the color of the ferric chloride is getting darker where the lines are exposed. So to make sure that the copper doesn't settle back in the line and stop the etch, you just have to keep the whole thing gently rocking. So while it's etching, you'll just kind of lightly lift up and down on a corner of your etching tub just to keep the acid moving. And there's a print next to the nice, right? And it, I know it's that weird because he's on that weird angle. It's so silly. But you can kind of see when you look at that some of the lines look nice and even like a pen, and some are a little more scratchy. So it almost is like the etching is the fastest in a way, but it combines the line quality of both the two other techniques. You can also play with the etching line by intentionally making the line thinner and then thicker. There is a tool that allows you to make a line that goes from thin to thick and back again. The master of that technique, of course, is Rembrandt, and you can see that a lot of his work he did in what he called stages, where he would print a bunch at one stage, then make changes, usually making it darker, etching again and again and again and again and again. So that's the same image, first version versus fourth version. More contemporary design. And then the aquatint, which I adore, you're going to put paste wax to block the areas that are white. You'll put a light spray of spray paint. The idea there is that wherever the spray paint is, the etch won't be able to get at the copper. So it won't be able to etch an area completely flat. If it did, no ink would stick to it. So that resist has to be there. And then we simply etch for a short amount of time, 3-4 minutes, cover more areas, etch again, 3-4 minutes, cover more areas, etch again. Once we clean it all off and ink it, you'll have areas that are stark white, light gray, dark gray, jet black. So you end up with an effect that looks like this. Some areas of white, some light, some middle, and some jet black. It kind of looks like a painting. And of course, you can print it in color. This would be a good example of an aquatint that was printed monoprint style. Each one is a slightly different color, but it's the same image. Mary Cassatt used dry point primarily to do the line work in her aquatints, and we have a full set of these. One of the few museums in the world that has all of the prints from this series is about 4 miles from us on, well, it's probably more than that, but on 17th. Cameron Art Museum actually owns the full set. It's one of the few American museums that has all of Cassatt's aquatint prints.
Didn't she live and work in Wilmington for a while?
She did for a brief time, yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that's all the ones you need to see for right now. This is good as a visual. Here's the contact paper or shelf liner paper version of making a stencil for a silkscreen screen. And here's the photo emulsion that we'll do. You coat the screen with the emulsion, prepare the positive, put the positive against the emulsion, expose it to light, spray out the dry or the soft parts, put the ink in, print to whatever surface. It's pretty amazing. So here you can see all of these prints were made with the same equipment that you guys are going to use. So the exposure unit, all of the printing equipment that was used for these was done in this room. So the big goal is the one at the bottom that has 3 colors or 4 combined. It's pretty impressive. This is work by one of my former students. Took print 1 and print 2 here at Cape Fear, went on and got his BFA in printmaking at ECU, then got his master's at Ohio University. He is now probably best known for his work in silkscreen. So that's from his professional artist webpage. So again, just to close out the day, when I say start here, go anywhere, I mean it. So that's the main things for you guys to need to be aware of. Be thinking about what designs you want to do subject-wise. It would be awesome if you brought me more than one idea to work with. Supply-wise, the only thing you need to buy, I am supplying tools, the ink, the paper. You guys need to come up with plates. So for your dry point and engraving, just go to Lowe's or Home Depot, grab a piece of plexiglass. They have it already cut to 8 by 10 inch size. It'll be labeled probably 0.08, which is of an inch, so it's relatively thin. That'll be fine. Usually the 0.05 or the 0.08 are perfect for what we're doing. It'll come with plastic on both sides that you just peel off. It would be smart to get 2 pieces, one for dry point, one for engraving, if you have the scratch to buy both at the same time. If you want to get 3, so you have 1 to set aside for monotype, that would be fine too. If you can only afford the 1, go for the 1. If you can't afford it, I bet you I can find you a scrap piece in the room. All right, so you don't have to worry a lot about pricing for this. Worry over the weekend more about your design idea. Think of a cool thing, line drawing, hatching, cross-hatching. Questions or freakouts or anything?
You said 8 by 10.
8 by 10. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they have them already cut to that size. It'll be, here you go. This one has a design on it. Actually, that's a little big. This is the size that you'll have. Right. So there's, I don't know if you can really see that in the slide, but there's a landscape image in there. So you can work your image all the way to the outer edges. I left a border on this one because this piece was made specifically for a small scale show, so they wanted the pieces to be really so of course, bless you, you can't figure it out. But for the first one, probably 8 by 10 is enough for us to go. Okay. Any other questions, supplies, or anything?
What about plates?
I want to show you specifically what you're up to next.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you can hang for a little bit,
Okay.
unless you guys have questions, we're good to go. I'll see y'all on Wednesday next week, or virtually. Hit me up with emails if you have questions. Okay. Anytime. All right. Have a great day, y'all. I'm going to stop the recording, Kim, and then we'll look at